For more than 47 years, our nonprofit, Resources for Seniors, has supported older adults and caregivers in Wake County. We can help in many different ways, including adult daycare programs, ramps and repairs, in-home supports, and consultation and referrals. Indeed, we're who to call when you're not sure who to call. Resources for Seniors stands ready to support you in your caregiving journey.
I'm Mark Costley, the founding attorney of Clarity Legal Group, the Triangle Area estate planning and elder law firm. You know those people who become overwhelmed dealing with the multiple challenges of being a caregiver? Clarity Legal Group helps people establish legal tools that avoid confusion, give them peace of mind, give them asset protection, and in some cases help them qualify for Medicaid. We help people get it right in the face of some of life's most important challenges. We don't just provide wills, trusts, and powers of attorney. We provide solutions and ongoing support. We provide clarity and peace of mind. It would be a privilege to help you.
Are you like 80% of seniors who would like to age in your current home? Call Wisdom Senior Care. Are you currently taking care of a loved one and finding yourself frustrated, tired, and even lonely? Call Wisdom Senior Care. Always available, dependable, and flexible. Come partner with Wisdom Senior Care, keeping wisdom at home.
Hi folks, thank you for joining us here today on Beyond the Obituary presentation. We're going to go over today how to avoid the top 3 funeral planning mistakes. Before we even get to that point, I did want to briefly discuss the history of the traditional American funeral. It's the funeral we are most accustomed to. We've been doing this for generations, and it really all started prior to 1900, after the Civil War, where furniture makers were also casket makers. And during the Civil War, embalming was introduced as a way to enable bodies of deceased soldiers to be able to be seen by their family members for a proper burial. Of course, back then, soldiers were coming from other states, and the technology wasn't there yet to be able to make a proper burial for somebody back home. But what was interesting is that when embalming became invented, a whole new era of funerals was about to take place, and that's what we are accustomed to now, although it is changing. And physicians were noted to be the first embalmers back in the 1800s. Really, it was all publicized with Lincoln's death, as he was paraded through many cities and many states, and many people questioned, how was this even possible? Well, it was the invention of embalming. And then the Industrial Revolution occurred with specifically the funeral industry, and that caused this separation between furniture makers and funeral directors. And that's basically how funeral directors became their own entity, and then eventually licensing boards formed and things like that. But I have a quick question here. If anyone knows what room of the home did the viewing take place? Just a little trivia here, outside the box for a moment. It was the parlor. And the parlor room, which doesn't resonate with many of us today, but the parlor room in the early 1900s and late 1800s was really a formal sitting room. This is where the body would be found for a home viewing. Funeral homes, when they came into existence, because families no longer wanted to have funerals or viewings at the home, and funeral homes became more popular, well, that was where the term funeral parlor came from. So now we're going to fast forward to the presentation in planning mistake number 1, not knowing your options. This is probably the most important thing. I can't tell you how many people we meet with personally, and the funeral directors I work with, that family members that are coming in for the first time and they just simply don't know the options that exist. So important, because if you are able to speak for your loved one, when they had passed on the information that they knew what they wanted, how much peace and how much relief that is for you and the family, and not having to make so many choices and decisions because you knew. It's really it really creates a lot of peace and just peace in knowing. So we know the traditional funeral. So we're going to move on to that and start here with green burial. So another burial option, but this is what we are known for at Renissance Funeral Home. So I'm going to go right into this. This is a popular option for burial where you're not using any embalming, you're not using a traditional cemetery, you're only using biodegradable materials such as a biodegradable casket, and you could even use a shroud in some cases, which takes really green burial to another level because most people are used to seeing a casket at the cemetery. However, with green burial, this allows a shroud to be used, which if you don't know what a shroud is, I have a picture here for you. The interesting thing to note about the shroud is that there is a backboard in the shroud. So the family or the pallbearers would actually be able to hold some of those ropes that you see and be able to maneuver the body over the grave with the help of the cemetery staff. And in that sense, it becomes a family event, and we see a lot of involvement with these burials with the family and friends, because even such things as carrying the body or burying the body afterward with the shovel, prayers, people are speaking, there's music, whether that be an instrument somebody brought or it could be anything. I mean, we can make it as traditional or untraditional as the family likes, but there are many options when it comes to that. Here you'll see a picture of a willow casket. So if you're not comfortable with using a shroud, we at Renissance Funeral Home would introduce you to something like this casket. Here you're going to see a seagrass casket. This one's actually quite popular. This is a picture at our local cemetery, Pine Forest Memorial Gardens in Wake Forest. What we do is we'll place the casket on top of this wagon, and the family, and we talked about the family getting involved. This is one instance where the family can actually pull the wagon up to the grave. The pine box that we're all familiar with and have heard about. What is cremation? Here is another option. So we had traditional burial, we had green burial, and now we have cremation as an option, as your third option. And basically cremation, as we know, it's the process of reducing the human remains to bone by flame and heat. The process takes about 2 hours, and the bone is reduced to what we commonly know as ashes, although the bone is actually not ash, it just simply looks like ashes. One of the best points and one of the reasons why cremation is so popular is because of the options that are involved. You can scatter the cremated remains, you can keep the cremated remains or the urn inside the home, you can bury that urn or the cremated remains in a cemetery. Here's another option for creating a tree through the use of the cremated remains. People have been using their cremated remains to build reefs. There are biodegradable urns, some that can go in water, some that can biodegrade in the ground. Some people will place the cremated remains in a columbarium. So you'll find these at cemeteries and churches. So there are many options with cremation, and this is one of the reasons why it's become so popular. Actually, 65% of the Triangle prefers cremation. So when we started our funeral home in 2003, that number was closer to 40%, and now here we are, 17 years later, that number has jumped up to about 65%. Just a couple of notes here with cremation. Cremation is always performed one at a time, and we do have a mandatory waiting period by law. We also have to have the death certificate signed by the doctor. Now, this is nothing that you have to concern yourself with, However, the one piece that I underlined here that you do need to concern yourself with is we cannot perform a cremation without a signed cremation authorization. And this is where planning plays a big role, because if your loved one is able to sign that cremation authorization before they pass away, then after the death, we do not have to involve the family. It's one less thing that needs to be done. So the cremation authorization top page looks something like that. It's a varying in length document, but can be anywhere from 3 to 7 pages, depending on what funeral home is using which type of forms, but they do need to be signed, and we're basically given permission by your family or by the individual coming to the funeral home. We're given permission to do the cremation, and that's what this purpose is. The purpose of this document is. It can be signed by the individual before death or the family after. All right, and if there is a healthcare power of attorney in the family, or even a friend at that point, if they have the rights of disposition clause within the power of attorney document, they can also act as the authorizer of the cremation. So in some cases where there is no family and you have the caregiver acting as the POA, as long as that POA document has the rights of disposition enacted inside the POA, they would be able to sign for the cremation at the funeral home. For those veterans out there, you have a few options at veteran cemeteries locally and outside the state. Here in North Carolina, we are lucky enough to have our own state veteran cemeteries. They're nearly all-inclusive with the benefits. The one interesting fact is you have to be a resident of North Carolina for 10 plus years, and a grave liner is required but not given with a state burial. So you can see all of the benefits there for the families that are requiring, or the families that decide they would like burial. And this could be with an urn, this can be with a casket. The national cemeteries are all-inclusive. They will cover every single cost when it comes to that burial, including the grave liner, which is required, and spouses are even given free burials. So we have another option here. So we talked about regular traditional funerals or traditional burial. We talked about green burial. We talked about cremation, and now we have anatomical donation. So locally, we have some universities in the area that will accept bodies for anatomical donation. And what an anatomical donation is, you as a living being are giving approval to use your body for science and study at the school. There is an application that is needed, and pre-approval is generally needed. So if this is of any interest to you or somebody you know, you would want to contact the local school and talk to somebody in the anatomical gifting program of that school. Okay. You also need a plan B. So if your plan A is to have an anatomical donation, you need to have a plan B, because the problem exists or can exist where after death, the body is not going to be accepted into the school. And this could be for many reasons. It does happen. It's not often, but it does happen. And that could just simply be some sort of a surgery had taken place after the application was placed in. If there was an accident that the individual was involved in and there was trauma to the body, if the individual had excessive weight gain, all of these things might contribute to reasons why the body would not be accepted by the school. So you have to be mindful of that and have a plan B in place. And the plan B can be one of the other options. The schools will all cremate the body after they have finished using it for their purposes. Sometimes the school will allow burial, but this is on a special case basis. After the cremation has taken place, the cremated remains are then sent to either the funeral home or the family, and at that point you can schedule a memorial service or any other services the family would like. With anatomical donation, the funeral director and funeral home is still needed because of transportation issues, and what I mean by that is upon death, the school does not come to the home or the place of death to pick up the body. The funeral home actually still needs to be called to go to the place of death and bring the body to the school. That's number one. And number two, most of these schools do not accept the body deliveries or transportations during after hours or during a weekend. So there might be a storage situation where the funeral home would have to store the body for several days, or if a holiday was occurring, until the next available business day. And at this point, I'm going to ask my colleague Heather Hill to come up and take my place, and she will continue this presentation.
Hi, I'm Heather Hill. I'm one of the funeral directors at Renissance Funeral Home. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I'm going to go over planning mistake number 2. Not sharing or documenting your choices. It's really important to decide what you want, write it down, and you have to tell somebody what your plans are. So make sure that the documentation is in place and somebody knows that it's in place. So some of the things that you have to decide what kind of funeral that you want. As Joe went over, we have traditional burial. Entombment is what we think about when your body is in a mausoleum above ground. Green or natural burial, cremation, anatomical donation. And with cremation, you also want to write down what your choices are for what you want your family to do with your urn, what you want them to do with your ashes. Do you want to be scattered over a mountaintop with permission from the owner of the property? Or do you want to be scattered in the ocean? You need to be 3 nautical miles out to do that. Or sprinkled in a beautiful river somewhere. So it's really important to let your family know what to do with your cremated remains. Or if you've bought a niche somewhere at a church, please let them know where you'd like your ashes to go or your cremated remains to go. It's really important choices to make and to tell somebody. So what other things besides the major funeral choices that you need to make? If you want to have your casket be made of willow or wicker, or do you want a metal casket for traditional burial, or do you like a cherry stained wood casket? These are things that you can choose ahead of time or discuss. Do you want people to be able to see you? Do you want people to be able to say goodbye? Do you want just your immediate family the option to say goodbye? These are things that these decisions are made at the arrangement table, and your family wants to make sure they're following your wishes. And the family also wants to make choices that are right for them. What are some funny stories or sweet stories that you want people to tell about you? What are some of the family legends that you may want people to share? How do you want to be remembered? These things can be written down in so many ways. You will have access to our digital planning guide. There's a place in there for you to write down your notes and your thoughts about how you want people to remember you. Do you want a full funeral at your local church? Do you want a funeral at the funeral home? Or do you want just a graveside service? And also think about the weather. If this happens in the winter, do you care where your funeral is, whether it's indoors, outdoors? Do you want to go in a traditional cemetery? Do you want to go in a green burial cemetery? You know, there are options for green burial for you to actually be buried on your own property. And if that's a choice for you to make, that is something that definitely needs some pre-planning. And that's something that we can answer in depth at another time. Your obituary. How do you want your obituary to read? Do you want to write that yourself and leave some empty blanks for your family to fill in? What do you want said about you? How do you want people to remember you? This is also called your living legacy, how you want people to remember you. What clothing do you want to wear? And do you have a favorite lipstick that you may want your family to choose for you? I've had families that have the funeral bag that mom has ready, and she's got her favorite nail polish and her lipstick all ready to go. Think of how many choices you won't have to make at a time where you're grieving. And pallbearers, who do you want to carry your casket? Who would be up for the honor to help at that point? These are some of we call the soft choices that you need to make. All of these choices we don't think about because we're not sitting in an arrangement conference. There's a lot of decisions to be made for a family when we're meeting with them. And these are just some ideas that can help you move forward in that area. So also, it's really difficult when we sit with families and they don't always know their grandparents' names. If your family has died and you don't know the deceased mother's maiden name, they're always calling a great aunt or somebody in the family or trying to find a family tree to find out this information. Having this important biographical information in place will definitely help your families when it's time to take care of the death certificate. Things like your full legal name, your maiden name, your social security number, where you were born, your father's full name, your mother's full name with maiden name, your occupation, your highest level of education. These are all things that are collected at the arrangement conference. Having this information given to your family ahead of time can really help at the arrangement as well. Because basically, you're pre-planning in order to make this process easier for those that you love. You're not so much doing it for yourself as for your loved ones. This is a picture of the planning guide that you'll get a digital copy of, and you'll find a lot of this pre-planning information in that guide. Planning mistake number 3 is relying on life insurance. We hear a lot of families say, I don't need to take care of anything because I've got life insurance and that will take care of everything. Well, less than 40% of people actually have life insurance. And when you are using life insurance, there can be an extra fee added on to the funeral service on the invoice. Other funeral homes don't accept life insurance, so the family would need to pay ahead of time and then be reimbursed by the life insurance. And a lot of times we'll find that, the children of the deceased know that mom had a policy, but she may have stopped paying on it and you didn't know this. Or the beneficiary may have been a spouse that has passed away years ago and that information was never updated. If there's a pending cause of death on the death certificate, a lot of life insurance companies won't pay until that is updated. So we need to make sure that all of those things, we don't rely on all of those because of all of those options. Insurance assignments are not always something that families, that insurance companies will allow the families to do. An insurance assignment is when the insurance company pays the funeral home directly. There are a lot of companies that won't do that. There's sometimes a long waiting period. The insurance company will have to mail a packet to the family, they'll have to find that information and then send it back. So life insurance isn't always a fail-proof way to plan for your funeral. And if your parents or your loved one is going on Medicaid, a lot of times that life insurance policy is considered an asset and it is not usable then for families anymore. They'll have to cash that policy in for the cash value in order to go on Medicaid. So life insurance isn't always a fail-proof way to pay for your funeral. So how will I pay? How do you pay for your funeral? Private pay, check or cash, credit card at the time of need. Families, if they have a joint account with you, they can take the money out of your account, or a funeral trust, a portable or transferable funeral trust. You can pay, there are payment plans available for a funeral trust. You can pay up front, you can make payments on a funeral trust. You can also have this funeral trust a protected asset from Medicaid. So a funeral trust is a great way to pay for your funeral ahead of time, knowing that your family will not have to worry about where to find the funds to pay for your funeral. Most funeral homes require payment at the time of service. It won't wait for most life insurance and will not wait for an estate to be settled. Funeral homes need paid by the time of the service. A funeral trust will usually pay that funeral home within 48 hours. So you're really taking the burden off of your family. And the added benefit of being a protected asset from Medicaid is why a lot of people choose to go that route. So to recap, some of the important things that we've gone over today: choices and options. Have you decided what you want? Do you want a green burial, traditional burial, entombment, anatomical donation? Have you documented your choices? Have you written them down and told somebody where they are so that they're able to find them at the time of death? That is also in the share and communicate. Please talk about what you want with your loved ones and make sure they know where your documents are. Look ahead of time for a funeral home. Don't wait until that day or the day after someone dies in order to investigate the funeral home that's right for you. Make phone calls. Get a feel for who you're talking to. Check reviews online. Look at their website. Make sure that the funeral home that you're choosing is a good fit for you. And how will you fund this funeral home? Do you have a funeral trust? Does your family know where to take the funds to pay for your funeral? These are all important choices and important things to think about and talk about. We find that so many families don't have these discussions with their loved ones. It's a hard talk to have. We know that. Nobody wants to talk about this. Nobody wants to talk about death and dying. Nobody wants to talk about not being here anymore. But when you think about it, you're making these choices for the people that you love. You are making this process easier. When these things are in place, when the time comes, then you will feel more at ease. Your family will feel at ease knowing that they're honoring your choices. These are really important decisions to make and conversations to have. We've had a lot of families ask, or other people ask, how do I bring this up to my family? How do I talk about this? And we find that a lot of times actually attending a funeral, if you've just attended a funeral, it's a good idea to say, hey, did you like how that funeral went? Do you want something similar to that? Or you see that our neighbor was cremated. Do you want the same choice? Or you attended a green burial. Hey, I like that idea. I think this is something that I'd like to do, which can bring up the discussion. You can also make your own plans and say to your family, this is what I've decided that I'd like to do. What would you like to do? These are really difficult situations, but if you place it back into the hands of, I want it to be easier when you die, that I know what to do and it will be easier for me. So please have these discussions, as difficult as they are. And as difficult as these discussions are, we look back to why they are difficult. Why is death such a taboo subject? Why do we avoid talking about death and dying? And not everybody does. Not everybody has difficulty with this conversation, but that's why we have brought a program into the funeral home called Death Cafe. Death Cafe is a program that was invented overseas in England, and it's a program that many funeral homes and many communities have picked up. It gives people a chance to come and talk openly about death and dying and why it's hard to discuss this. Share with people in your community your thoughts about what you want, and people will share what they want. And it's a very welcoming place to be and to talk about these things. We do host one at Renissance Funeral Home. We will host again, hopefully, after the pandemic. And we find different topics that come up. Topics that are going on in society when there's been the loss of a superstar, or a lot of deaths happening over a natural disaster. We find that we talk about those kinds of things. We talk about different ways we grieve. We talk about how to help a grieving friend. We talk about our rituals in our own families growing up. So if that's something that you're interested, I invite you to reach out to us, because it is a very welcoming, opening community of folks that we will be starting this again, hopefully soon. So it's called Death Cafe, and I know it's a funny name. It's not one that we started, a name that we started, but I urge you to look into Googling Death Cafe and find out what it's all about, and we'd love to see you there. I thank you for your time.
So now for some frequently asked questions that we hope to answer for you today, maybe get a clearer picture on funeral planning. One of the most popular questions we get is what to do when somebody dies. Now this is dependent on where the person has passed away. In general, if somebody passes away at home and they are under hospice care, you are going to contact the hospice facility. If they are at home and not under hospice care, you're normally going to call 911, and EMS will have to come to the home to pronounce. At that point, EMS or the police officer at the scene will then call us to transport your loved one back to the funeral home. If a death occurs at a facility, such as a hospital, a hospice facility, or a nursing home, one of those facilities will have a staff member that calls the funeral home. And we will arrive normally within an hour to come take your loved one into our care. In deaths that are accidental, your loved one may be taken to the medical examiner's office, and at that point, you would be calling us to inform us of that. But like I said, most of the time, you're going to be calling your hospice nurse or letting the staff of that facility call us. One of the other frequently asked questions we get involves cremation. The soonest cremation can occur is 24 hours, but that is only if we have a death certificate signed and the cremation authorization has been signed by either the person who has passed before they passed, obviously, or the family. Under no circumstances do we ever transport a body back to the funeral home and immediately do a cremation. That has never happened. There are more steps involved than that, and we always want to get the family's permission to do so. Another frequently asked question is if you will have a chance to say goodbye to your loved one before cremation. That is always offered. Every family, whether they are choosing a public service, private services, or absolutely no services, they are always given the opportunity to say goodbye to their loved one prior to cremation. One of the other questions we receive is what will happen after the body has been brought back to the funeral home. Normally, we will have the family come in for arrangements either later that day or the next day, and the arrangement conference will last somewhere around 45 minutes to an hour long, and we will discuss everything pertaining to the decisions of the person who has passed or the decisions of the family for the person who has passed regarding the funeral and the disposition, whether we're going to do cremation or burial. Embalming is never required by law. At least it is not required in North Carolina. So we are able to perform services and have viewings and visitations and goodbye ceremonies without embalming. So there's never a cost that you have to incur unless you decide to have that be so. Due to the times that we currently are in with COVID-19, we're finding more families are conducting private services. One of the interesting ways we can help facilitate private services is through technology, through streaming. We have the ability of cameras and using Facebook Live, YouTube, Zoom, all of those instruments as a way to broadcast and get the services, funeral services, viewing, or family messages out to others that are unable to make it. These times have created, in some cases, though challenging, though possibly a blessing in disguise, because it's created a more intimate moment for the family to absorb this death and not have the distraction of other guests and the public at the funeral home or at their home. And so we have gotten feedback from families stating that they were glad that they were able to just simply be here with their loved one without others being present. One of the other frequently asked questions we receive involves pricing. There is a whole spectrum of pricing when it comes to funeral services, and there lies a parallel thought with regards to pricing of funeral services with that of, let's say, a car, in the sense that if you go to a car dealership and ask how much does a car cost, you'd probably get the same response if you asked a funeral director how much does a funeral cost. There are many varying factors. The least expensive, though, being a direct cremation with no other services being done. The cremation would take place when all of the proper documentation was complete, and the family would be there days later to pick up the urn or when they were ready. That would be your least expensive option. Now, cremation can also occur after funeral services, so we can have a body present. We can also have a private visitation. We could go to a church or a facility for a service and do the cremation after. With cremation being done first, it allows the urn to be present for memorial service or a family get-together at a later date. One interesting thing about the current times is that families are delaying their memorial services with the urn being present. With a cremation, it affords you the ability that time is on your side. You can decide when you and your family will get together. And in some cases, that can be many months later. The ceremony can be out of town, in another place, another state. The increase in cremation over the last decade in the area has brought about some changes in the way we conduct funerals, but it doesn't take away the importance of a funeral. And one thing I believe we all need to keep in mind is a funeral is not simply for the deceased. In actuality, it's more for us, because we are the ones that are surviving. We are the ones here to celebrate the life. And when deciding what to do for your loved one, it's important to take in consideration those family members and friends that will be paying respect to your loved one. It might be easy to just simply state that I'm going to have a cremation like mom or dad wanted, but take the urn home and not have any sort of a celebration or memorial service. However, that life was more than just one that was involved with you and in your circle, but more that your mom or dad had their own circle, and that could be organizations, that could be extended family members. And just taking into consideration all of those factors before deciding what type of service you're going to have, or if no service. And keep in mind, you don't have to stick with any of the traditions or be traditional. There are many different things that you can do. Discuss it with your family, discuss it with the funeral director. I'd like to pass on one of the very interesting services we were able to be a part of at the funeral home, and it could be an option you might consider for yourself. Before the gentleman had passed, he came in and spoke with us, actually many times, and he was intent on recording a memoir basically, of himself and a presentation for his funeral guests. So when it came time to have his memorial service at the funeral home, the guests were greeted by his voice and his stories and what he wanted to express to everybody there in his living self, recorded prior to his passing. And it was a surprise for everybody. And you can imagine what kind of a response that got. And so I simply state that to give you all some ideas and maybe an option of doing something similar, creating slideshows. We have plenty of families who create slideshows from digital pictures. A funeral home can create that for you. Funerals can take place anywhere. They can take place at the funeral home. They can take place at a church or other facility. They can take place outdoors. And with COVID and the current situation, these services can be streamed. So we are very portable, and the choices are really endless as far as what you would like to do. One last interesting thing that was brought to my mind are cremated remains and the options that you have to make use of the cremated remains, whether it be bringing them home, putting them in the columbarium. We have had family members who had created jewelry out of cremated remains. There are reefs that we talked about in the presentation that can be created for the sea and the ocean creatures. Fireworks. People have placed cremated remains in fireworks. And these may seem extreme, exotic, and maybe something that interests you, maybe not. But my point is that if anything is on your mind that you would like to accomplish to make this service more personal, it really is important to bring that up to the funeral director and your family, and we could work with you on more options that would be personal for your loved one and your family. Thank you, folks, for listening to our presentation. Please contact us on our website, rfhr.com. Be happy to answer more questions and anything that's on your mind. Thank you.